Hello, this will be part 4 in the foliage prop creation tutorial series. Last video we talked about how to create the base texture set for our modular tree props, or tree parts. So this video we're going to talk about how to create the opacity detail, the transparent areas versus non-transparent areas. So in the previous video in Substance Painter we created a PBR metallic roughness with alpha blending template, and then we built our base PBR materials. So the alpha blending template setup will give us the option to have opacity. So if I go to any one of these subset materials, if I look at my channels under the material, there's a color, height, rough, metallic, normal, emissive, and then with that alpha blending template, we now have the OP or opacity setting. So it's actually better to do opacity on separate layers compared to doing them with this, but you can also add opacity detail from every material once you have the alpha blending template set. So what I'm actually going to do is create a new fill layer. So add fill layer, and we'll call this one opacity. Okay. All right, so with this fill layer, I'm going to go to the properties, and I'm going to turn off everything but color and opacity right now. So I don't want to use height, roughness, metallic, normal, or emissive for this layer. It's a fill layer with a basic gray, and we're going to use a mask to determine what areas are going to be transparent versus opaque. I typically would like to use some kind of brighter color so I can see the difference of where I'm painting. So let's just use like this red, like a red color right now. In the end, I'm not going to use the color channel, but I'm using the color channel right now to help me visualize where I'm painting the opacity detail. So what that means is with this layer I can then drag opacity on or off, and right now it means the entire thing is completely opaque or semi-transparent if it's less than 0, or more than 0, less than 1, and if it's 0 it's completely transparent. So that's what the ability of that alpha blending template gives us. So what I'm actually going to use this for is to define the leaves in a more specific way by adding transparency with a map. So here are the two options. If I create a black mask, let's go ahead and try that. Let's do add a black mask to this layer. That removes any transparency away. And with a regular brush, I can use the bracket keys, the keys to the right of the P key. I can then come in here and draw on areas that will be transparent. Okay, so if I come in here and draw off that area, it's going to color it red, which means that's going to be a transparent area. If I go back off of the mask and click back on the base fill layer, and I drag the opacity slider all the way down, it's going to make that area completely transparent. So the opacity uniform color of 1 is not transparent. Opacity uniform color of 0, that area is transparent. So if I look at this from other angles, you can see that the plane, the geometry, is no longer visible where I've painted that off. So that's what we can do with an opacity map. So if I want to manually paint on detail, I can just use a black mask, and with a regular brush, paint on the areas, and the brush was with a white value. So if I look at my preview here, there's a little white line on my map, my mask map, and that means that's the areas that are going to be transparent. Now this is actually an inverted value, so in the mask, black values are opaque, white values are transparent. When Substance Painter actually pushes these maps out, it's going to invert those values. So for the final map, white will be opaque, black will be transparent. But as we're painting in Painter, it is going to have the black values as opaque and white values as transparent. Now that's okay, but then we can also use our images that I discussed at the beginning of this or last video, which is black and white images of a leaf. So it could take me some time to paint in an individual leaf shape. So instead I'm going to use this image here as an alpha with a brush to paint on this specific leaf pattern. So what I want to do is actually remove out that black mask. I'm going to right click and choose remove mask, and I'm going to drag my uniform opacity back to 1, and instead I'm going to use a white mask. So at a white mask, that means everything is going to be visible until I paint it off, or everything's going to be transparent until I paint it off, excuse me. And I'm going to use an alpha. So let's go to our alphas, and I want to drag in those images and define those as alphas. And then I'm going to use my paintbrush to paint on in my UV map to define what areas are transparent and what areas are opaque. So to do that, I need to use my image. Just to reiterate, this needs to be a square image, so I'm using a 2048 by 2048 map. And the black areas are transparent and the white areas are opaque. Okay, and if it's gray areas, it's going to be semi-transparent. So I have 3 different images to give me some variety here so that all the leaves don't look the exact same, and I have 3 individual leaves that I need to paint. So I'm going to click and drag one oak leaf image into the Alphas tab, and I'm going to say Import Resources. I'm going to define that as an alpha, and then we'll say Import your resources to this project, and we'll do Import. Okay. So that creates this image, and if I have that selected with the brush, scale it up a little bit, you can see it's going to start painting this brush with that image. Okay. I'm actually going to go ahead and pull in my other 2 leaf alphas and drag that one in, and we'll do the same thing. Define as alpha, import resources to this project. Do the same thing for the 3rd one. Alright, so define as alpha, import to this project. Alright, so all 3 of my images are in here. Click on another one. Click on the 3rd one. There you go. And now I'm ready to start painting on my leaves. So if you can see, as I'm painting or trying to paint over in the 2D view or 3D view, it's going to change that angle, which can distort that image. Right? It's also going to change the size depending on the scale of the bottle. So with my brush, and I'm going to go to my brush, and what I'm going to do is go down to the area that says alignment in the properties. I'm going to change it from tangent to UV, so alignment to UV, and size space to texture. So that way I'm going to be painting on this opacity detail in my UV view, so now it's not scaling or changing the angle or form. It's going to be a perpendicular angle to what I'm painting. So that'll be exactly how I want it to. Alright, so here's my 3 individual leaves, and I'm going to use my left or right bracket key to scale up and down my brush. There you go. So I'm going to zoom in so I can get a better view. Alright, so this is the middle leaf right here, and I'm going to use my first leaf, and we'll see what happens when I paint on there. Okay, there you go. So what that does is it makes this area visible, as in opaque. So when I paint on there, if I look at my preview, that black area in the mask is now opaque. It's not going to be transparent. All other areas are transparent on the model. So I just clicked and painted one leaf. If I go back to the material preset there and drag the opacity to the left, that's the only area that is going to be opaque right now. All the rest of it is going to be transparent. So let's take our second leaf and go back to our mask. And let's make sure our second leaf is selected. There we go. And then here's our second leaf. Scale this up so we can see it. And once again, let's add to our mask. There you go. So that leaf is now painted on there. If it's colored, that means that's going to be opaque. If it's red, that means that's going to be transparent. So let's go to our third leaf, which is this one right here. Scale that down. Paint it on there. There you go. So our individual leaves now have opaque detail. The rest is transparent. So if I put it all the way down and move it around, you can see now it looks like an actual leaf. It doesn't look like a polygonal plane anymore. But the issue is that my bark is transparent as well, and I don't want that to happen. So I'm going to pull my opacity back up to 100. Let's go back to our mask, and I'm going to get my polygon fill tool, make sure I'm back on UV chunk. My value should be black, and I'm going to click and drag on those bark areas. So when I click and drag on the bark areas, it's going to add that opaque detail back to my bark areas. So as it updates my mask, those areas are black, which means that's going to be opaque. So those areas are no longer going to be transparent when I go back to my material and drag down my opacity all the way. So those bark areas are still visible. Just my transparent areas will go away. Alright, so now what I can do is go around, and this is kind of like a leaf canopy, and go with my individual leaves once again. So this is the medium one, so we'll start there. And I like to turn on, if you go to the display settings, turn on down at the bottom, show mesh wireframe. I can see the wireframe, looking for the center of this. And now I can come in here and add individual leaves back to it. So one thing that you can do is actually go back up to the top of the brush and find angle and rotate my angle around. That will rotate the brush size or brush angle. So we'll put another leaf there, throw one and put one there. So now I'm just trying to build like a leaf pattern. Okay, so maybe this one is a little larger. Put some right there. Scale that down and put maybe one right there. We'll get a couple more leaves in here. And then I'll show you what the final aspect could look like. Go the opposite way, there you go. Maybe we'll scale this down and put a couple more angles in here. One right there. Do a couple more in the middle. Okay. Go. All right, so that way I now have, kind of a leaf canopy. I can draw some vines and things like that in there. So basically with the brush and on a mask, I am going to paint in using a alpha image and adjusting the rotate angle. That rotate angle will just stamp that leaf pattern in different rotate angles there. So then I'm going to repeat the same thing for the other parts. All right, I'm going to pause the video and I'll open up my finalized scene here because this takes some time to be able to build or paint on all the leaves. So I'll show you what my final output is and then we'll talk about exporting out and getting ready to pull this back to showcase on our model. All right, so here is a more finalized version of this. I've refined the textures a little more, add a little bit less red and orange to the bark, and refined my leaf texture. So I have my individual leaves, it's right there. And then I have my little leaf canopies, 1, 2, and 3. And then I have like my billboard, kind of like bushes or small little leaf patterns that are over here. Okay. And what I've done is I can come in here and turn off, let's turn off the color. So let me show it with the color on. If I put the opacity all the way down, I can see that they're transparent. But if I look at this, there's kind of like a red, hard to see, but a slight red glow around the outside of it with how it does the transparency with the color. So what I'm going to do before I export is to make sure I turn off my color. So there's no color associated with this fill layer. It's just the opacity. And my color textural details on layers underneath that. Okay. So those are ways that we can build opacity with our PBR textures. It's a separate fill layer with a mask, and we're painting on areas that are opaque versus transparent. So if I look at my mask, the black areas are opaque, the white areas are transparent. But just to reiterate, once we export this out, it's going to invert those values. So a final opacity mask is the white areas are opaque, the black areas are transparent. As I'm painting them, I'm going to be painting on the black areas as opaque. So that's the process of building materials and opacity for a foliage prop. So the final thing we're going to do in this video is talk about how to export out our textures, which is a pretty easy process. Make sure I have everything visually how I want to and call this tree for the material. And then if I go to File, Export Textures, I'm going to go to the Output Templates. And one thing I'm just going to make sure that we understand is it's going to go ahead and export these. But in the PBR Metallic Roughness, that opacity map is not going to get saved as a separate map. And that's what we want. We want it to be saved in the alpha channel of the base color map. So here's our base color. And the red, green, and blue channels are going to be from our textural detail. And then the alpha channel is going to be our opacity map. So that's exactly how we want this to set up. But I just want to mention that because that is how it's going to be saved out. So we're still only going to have 4 texture maps, but the opacity detail is in the alpha channel of the base color map. So if I do list of exports, base color, emissive, height, metallic, normal, rough, I'm not going to use the height or emissive, but the opacity detail is in the alpha channel of the base color. We're going to use a PNG at 2048 texture map. So let's go make sure we save it to the right locations. Let's go to desktop and we'll do our tree project. Here we go. And let's do list of exports and export. Let it run through that process and then we'll open them up to see what they look like individually. Exported files, successful. All right. Okay, so here's our folder that we just created with our source alpha images. And here are our texture maps that we just built. So I don't need the emissive and I don't need the height. If I can double click on my base color, you can see that it actually is taking out the background for the leaves. So it treats that as white, or some image editors may treat that as gray or black, but that'll show you that this image is saving that opacity detail in the transparency. So it'll visually look like the leaves there, but it's not going to save any of that background detail. In the alpha, it saves the opacity detail. So there's what my base color with alpha opacity looks like. There's my metallic, a little bit of shininess on the bark. There's my normal map, and there's the roughness. Okay, so some shiny versus matte areas, and then metallic has a little bit of reflectivity on where the areas are shiny. So that's the process of creating textures in Substance Painter with opacity. The next video we're going to come back and talk about how to get these texture maps back in Maya, and then also in in Sketchfab, and the similarities and how we're going to apply the textures there.